Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kyla Hannington, and I'm the Public Outreach and Engagement Division Manager with the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights, the county's civil and human rights education and enforcement agency. Our office investigates complaints of discrimination. We help combat human trafficking around our county and the region. We ensure equitable language access to county government services, and we also provide an outreach program that brings diverse voices and viewpoints to the people of the county and the region, and that creates opportunities for conversation. We believe that we have much to learn from each other, and through conversation, connection, and community, we can change the world. Tonight, it is my pleasure to welcome you to a very special conversation in honor of Native American and Indigenous Heritage Month, in which we welcome Cassidy Caron, President of Canada's Métis National Council. Since 1983, the Métis National Council has been the national and international voice of the Métis Nation within Canada. Through the Canada-Métis Nation Accord, the MNC advocates on behalf of its governing members, the democratically elected Métis Governments of Ontario, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia, to advance Métis rights and interests within their respective jurisdictions, including the implementation of the Métis Nation's inherent right to self-determination and self-government. The MNC is committed to accountability and transparency within its operations and to its relations with MNC governing members. And Cassidy Caron is the president of the Métis National Council. She's a Métis woman with roots in the historic Métis communities of Batoche and St. Louis, Saskatchewan. She grew up closely connected to her Métis traditions, heritage, and culture, and is driven by her family and community values of respect, honesty, collaboration, and responsibility. Cassidy is the first elected woman to hold the office of president of the Métis National Council. She is a nation builder, using the knowledge, skills, and perspectives acquired through her formal education, professional and political experiences, as well as through her deep community involvement. Cassie's goal is to explore and utilize innovative approaches to community development and nation building, which promote effective collaboration and deeper understanding between Indigenous peoples and all Canadians. As an entrepreneur, Cassie has advised and evaluated both provincially and nationally administered programs that aim to serve and support Indigenous peoples and communities across Canada. She has also supported the implementation of initiatives in, by, and for Indigenous communities throughout Canada in a variety of sectors, all of which sought to achieve an overarching goal of restoring balance and wellness to Indigenous communities. So Cassidy, welcome. It is so wonderful to have you.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
I do feel like I should say for full absolute disclosure, full honesty, we're very transparent here. I went to university with Cassidy 10 years ago at Vancouver Island University in Vancouver Island. And it's just been so amazing to catch up with you and to see where life has taken you since we were last in class. But I was hoping to get us going, that if you could just tell us and tell the viewers, like, who are the Métis people?
Sure. So hello, everybody. It's so great to be here. It's interesting to explain to non-Canadians who Métis people are. And I'll do my best to explain it. But Métis is one of the three recognized Indigenous or Aboriginal people recognized by the Canadian government. So in Canada, we have three distinct peoples, many different nations within those peoples, but there's First Nations, there's Inuit, and there's Métis. And those three peoples are recognized in Canada's Constitution. We're recognized as having inherent rights to self-government, self-determination. And so the Métis Nation is a people who were born out of a process of ethnogenesis. So it's a process of mixing that happened in a distinct time, within a distinct geography. And this mixing actually happened between Europeans who were coming over to settle in Canada. They were largely in the fur trade with the Hudson Bay Company, the Northwest Company, mixing and creating relations with First Nations people in or what is now known as Canada. This mixing, though, it happened, like I say, during this really distinct time and in this distinct socio-political era within what is now known as Canada. And the mixing over time led to the creation of a brand new people who were no longer European. They were no longer First Nation. They were very distinct with their own culture, language, traditions, music, and so many other things. Just this distinctiveness came to be. And so we are the newest nation in what is now known as Canada, and asserted ourselves prior to effective control in areas from the northwestern of Ontario, throughout the prairie provinces, up into the southern Northwest Territories, into northeast British Columbia, and even into the very northern states of the United States. And so there was communities throughout that landmass that Métis people settled, made a home, made their lives. And today we are recognized as an Indigenous people in Canada, and we have our own ways of governing ourselves, representing ourselves, and moving forward with implementing those inherent rights that we have as Indigenous peoples on these lands.
Okay, that was an awesome introduction, and I do have a couple of questions from there. So you mentioned, of course, the breadth of the Métis people, but you used a term, you said prior to effective control. And so I was wondering if you could explain what you meant by that.
Sure. So essentially, prior to when Canada asserted itself within that landmass. So prior to the province of Manitoba joining Confederation, our communities were already there. They were there before the British colony came over and started settling and taking over control of those land masses and creating the country of Canada.
So we just read for one of the conversations we do, where we have a conversation called the Elephant You Don't See Diversity Dialogue, where we'll, the hosts will all read the same book and then discuss it. And we were just reading the book Not a Nation of Immigrants. And it's focusing specifically on the United States. But one of the things it was talking about was really the occupying force, the colonizing occupying force, and like really outlaying the founding government as this, occupier, and the army as an occupier. And so I think from it's really the same. So you mentioned Confederation. So for those people listening, for Canada, that's 1867. And that's when these various parts of Canada, or what is now Canada, that some people decided we're now going to all sort of join together. And really what I'm hearing is the same kind of occupying force then washing over the land and what is it? Effective control. Yeah. Asserting a sort of dominance over and political system and ways of being across people. So, and the other thing I want to say just from your introduction is, are there Métis people in the United States?
Yes, there are. So in the northern United States, North Dakota, Minnesota, what we call across the medicine line. These borders that separate Canada, the United States, they separate our provinces, those didn't exist when our societies were here prior to effective control. We crossed those borders before they were patrolled, before there were systems that said that you can go here, you can't go here. So we do have relatives in the northern United States, and there are communities down there because they are in the United States now and we are in Canada. We don't have relations to govern ourselves, each other, but we are related. Our ancestors are related, and our ways of knowing and being are the same.
So actually we have a question, which I'll put on the screen because I think it's follows perfectly from what we're talking about. This is actually my dad. Hi, Dad. And so he says, I'm curious to know if any other countries have people akin to the Métis. Does the U.S. government recognize the Métis in its northern states? Do you know the answer to that?
So I don't know the answer to the latter part of that question. But there are actually other countries that do have Indigenous people that are akin to Métis. But Canada is the only country that recognizes this mixed Indigenous people within its constitution. But that does happen in other countries. It has happened in other countries because what's different about just simple mixing of of European or non-Indigenous and Indigenous people is that if it were to happen today, a non-Indigenous person mixing with an Indigenous person, their offspring isn't Métis. That mixing had to have happened within that, like I say, that distinct time and geography, and then their offspring from that mixing makes them Métis. The mixing that happens today is just, that person would then be their non-Indigenous identity as well as their Indigenous identity, and it doesn't make them Métis today.
So this is so to be Métis, your family, your ancestry is from pre-1867.
Yeah.
Is it primarily like Red River Valley, Manitoba, or is it all of the areas that you?
So it was in the historic Northwest, which was, like I say, that period and that space was from largely the northwestern Ontario into the Prairie provinces, and then from the Prairie provinces that moved westward prior to effective control. So I do have family that traces back to the Red River, but my family predominantly identifies as Otopimiswak, which is a Cree word meaning they own themselves. They are their own bosses. And that stems from the prairies, the buffalo hunters, where my family was from. So that's how I typically identify. But you have to have your genealogy traced back to one of these historic Métis communities within the historic Métis Nation back in that historic time. So it's very distinct, and it is much more than just being mixed.
Is that an ongoing tension in your work in Canada, the Métis identity?
Yeah, it is. It's something that's talked about quite a lot here in Canada. There's a lot happening right now within Canada of people who are claiming to be Indigenous, not just Métis, but First Nations and also Inuit, who actually are not. And they have no connection to those communities. They have no ancestry. It's a very odd phenomenon coming from myself as a Métis woman. Our families have gone through so much. We have gone through a process where other people have tried to take away all that we are and implement new systems and new ways of being onto our people. And it has caused significant trauma, and there are systems that still perpetuate injustices against our people. So for non-Indigenous people to want to claim indigeneity and see it as a way to really further their own careers or, get more rights or something, it boggles my mind as to why somebody would want to do that. But that is happening here in Canada and is being talked about largely in mainstream media today.
And we talked a little bit about some of those big cases, or at least one of them, when we were waiting for to get going. Then I will say that there's been similar stories in the United States. That same phenomena is happening with the artificial identity, and it sort of feels like there are some people who are, I think, thinking that that's a way to get to the front of a line that they were already at the front of, really, in lots of ways in terms of like government goodies and things. So it's that whole identity piece is a large conversation, and I would be happy to talk to you more about it. But I do want to ask a question again to provide history, again, for a lot of our people who are watching who are from the United States. The history of the Métis people is so rich and interesting, and so I was hoping you could talk to us about some of the heroes and the leaders of the Métis people.
So there are so many, and the work that we're doing at the Métis National Council right now is to tell all of the many stories of our people, to talk about the diversity that exists within the Métis Nation, to talk about, there is no specific one way to be Métis. But it is very well known that we do have a lot of talked about heroes within the Métis Nation, one of whom is Louis Riel. And actually, 2 days from now, on November 16th, is Louis Riel Day here in Canada. Louis Riel Day commemorates and honors and memorializes actually the day that he was executed by the state. It wasn't even yet Canada who executed him, but he was executed for treason. Louis Riel was a leader of the Métis people. He was an organizer. He organized our people to push back against some of the injustices that were being perpetuated while these lands were being settled. Our rights were being infringed upon. Our ways of knowing and being were being taken away and replaced by other ways of knowing and being. And Louis Riel actually led, alongside others like Gabriel Dumont, a resistance against what is now known as Canada. It's actually Canada's only national war happened between my people, my ancestors, and Canada when they sent over British troops to quell our people. It happened in 1885, known as the Battle of Batoche, and Batoche is where my grandfather is from. His homestead actually still is there on those lands. But Louis Riel led that resistance. He was a hero for fighting for our rights, and he died for it. And so he's one of our heroes. He's written about in Canadian history textbooks, but in a very different way than we tell it. For Canada, he was treasonous. He fought against our people. But he's also celebrated by the French community in Canada, the Francophones, because when Louis Riel actually negotiated the province of Manitoba into confederation, he did that and tried to make sure that Métis rights were upheld in that process. And actually in that process, he fought for bilingualism. To protect French language. And so he's also a hero to the Francophone community in Canada, which is a really fascinating nuance when talking about him as a Métis man.
Right. Well, that's great. We have I was thinking about, you're talking about fighting for rights inside the Canadian government. So I do want to talk a little bit about your specific job as the president of the Métis National Council. And so that's a big question, because I think I want to talk about, maybe you can tell us about the Métis National Council, and then also like, what do you do? What are you working on?
Sure. So the Métis National Council, we are the recognized collective of Métis governments in Canada at the national and international level. So the Métis National Council is comprised currently of 4 Métis governments that represent Métis citizens, Métis rights holders in the provinces of British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario. And they have their own governments to represent their people, to deliver culturally appropriate services and programs to Métis people within these provinces. And they come together to comprise the Métis National Council. So I get my mandate from those Métis governments to advance one strong Métis voice at the national and international levels. This year, or coming up next year, will be the 40th anniversary of the Métis National Council. The Métis National Council formed because there was that need to continue to push the Canadian government, and even at the international levels, at the UN, with a distinct Métis voice, to make sure that our rights were being recognized, that we're fighting for them, that we are continuously identifying what our rights actually are and how to implement them through the Canadian court system. And so my job is to be the national spokesperson for the Métis Nation, and continue to raise awareness of who Métis people are, to fight for closing socioeconomic gaps between Métis people and all Canadians, and really just carve out a future that is bright for our future generations as Métis people.
Has it been challenging, so on an international scale, to have a seat at the table? Does the Canadian government, like the official Canadian government, like get the seat, and then you've got to be like, we also, how does that work? How do you get a seat at the UN? Or you were just in Egypt. I'd love to hear about that. first of all, what are you doing on the international scale, but also how do you have to advocate to get there?
Yeah, so we're still in the process of advocating to get there. It's different within every facet of the United Nations. It is just as you say, you know, Canada gets a seat, and with our positive relationship right now with the Canadian government, they will bring us along as parties to the United Nations.
Okay.
So just last week, I was over in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt for COP27, which is the United Nations conference on or forum on climate change. There has been an international Indigenous caucus that has formed to ensure that Indigenous voices are always heard. There are quote unquote friendly countries that allow the Indigenous voice to be brought through those countries to that international stage. Canada is absolutely one of those friendly countries to have our voices heard. We don't have our own dedicated seat, but it's something that we are trying to fight for. We are fighting for enhanced participation at the United Nations, because every decision that's being made on the international stage, just as it is in Canada, needs to have our perspective involved. We need to be fighting to make sure that people know who we are, that we have these inherent rights. We took ginormous strides forward with the development of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, recently adopted by Canada, and now being implemented in Canada. There's an act that has passed in Canada to implement it. And so we're in the development of an action plan on how we are actually going to harmonize Canadian laws to ensure that the rights of Indigenous people are upheld.
So this is a big deal. The reason I went like this is because I remember, and I wasn't in university that long ago, that Canada had not ratified that, not that long ago, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So they have come along and are making progress. Ish.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating process. It's one that is going to take, well, I think when it was passed, the goal was to have all the laws harmonized within 20 years. It's a big job to do. And so right now that is what we're looking at. We're looking at how is this done in a good way? How is this done in a right way? How do we get this right? Because there isn't a precedent that is set for this. And so we're working as the Métis Nation with Canada to make sure this is done in a good way. We are collaborating with First Nations and Inuit as well to make sure it's done on that broader Indigenous scale, making sure that we're working together there. But yeah, it's a big job.
Is there a constant, is it a constant negotiation to also inside that space, you use language, and I'm not quoting you, I don't remember exactly what it is, I'm going to paraphrase, that there's a friendly relationship with the government of Canada. And so because of that, you are included in things. That implies that at a future date, you could be excluded, which is not, because again, the power structure can sort of just decide. So is that kind of a constant negotiation, or is there a way to ensure that vulnerability is closed?
So there is, and it is through legislation, and we're fighting for that. So our Métis governments right now are actually going through the process of developing self-government agreements. We have agreements signed with Canada that say that they're working towards it. They're negotiating what that means, what it means to be essentially a third order of government in Canada. So we'll have the federal government, the provincial government, and then we'll have Indigenous governments. We won't get there until there's legislation that's passed that introduces that. We are looking at introducing that legislation either in this fall session or early in the winter session. And so we're getting there, but that legislation is the only thing that will protect that forward movement to ensuring our rights are always upheld. But we're also doing that with every single piece of legislation that gets passed in Canada. That's a big part of my job, is to, well, not just my job, I have a great team that reviews legislation to make sure that it is not infringing upon our rights, that our voices are heard, and through the legislation development process and our process of passing legislation in Canada, I get different opportunities to go and speak to the different committees that are developing the legislation, to our Senate, who is ultimately the body that passes our legislation, to make sure that they know that our perspective is included and that our rights are not going to be infringed upon. But we have a really long way to go. We have made really big strides forward in these recent years with the current federal government that we do have, because, like I say, it is friendly to Indigenous people. Our Prime Minister has said that the most important relationship to Canada right now is that with Indigenous peoples in Canada. And it's not perfect. Relationships never are. But there are certain things that point to our country wanting to do better. We have now an Indigenous Governor General. So Canada is still tied to the monarchy, to the British Crown. And so we have a representative of the Crown in our country. And that representative is an Inuk, an Inuit woman. Her name is Mary Simon, and she is an incredible human being, first and foremost. But she has then been tasked with the person who represents the Crown in Canada. And that was an appointment by our Prime Minister. And that just shows that, there's more Indigenous people who are taking on these roles, who are representing our country in different ways. And it points to that direction that we are moving, that Canada as a country was built by, the fathers of Confederation. There was a certain number of non-Indigenous men who sat around the table and talked about, what is this country going to look like? How do we bring this country together? And now we're moving towards, redeveloping our country and bringing more voices to the table. Thinking about, what would our country have been like if we had the grandmothers of Confederation, or that diversity that Canada now has? What would that have looked like? What would our country look like? But we don't have to dwell on the past. We have the opportunity to bring those voices to the table now. And there are many forums where Canada is bringing our voices to the table. And we do have input into how we are moving forward and building a brighter future for the Métis Nation, but for all Canadians as well.
This is, because there's so much to talk about. This is so good. We actually already have 4 questions, so I'm going to take you through those. And then I want to talk also, so I'm just going to say this out loud so that we can circle back to it. One of the things I do want to talk about is specifically your journey as the youngest president of the Métis National Council, the first female president. You talked about the Fathers of Confederation, and there's been kind of a monolith. And so sort of what's happening now and what's that like for you. But let me get to some questions first, because I really appreciate everybody watching and putting some questions in the chat. So first of all, we have this question: were the Métis also taken to residential schools?
Great question. So yes, Métis were taken to residential schools. And it was only really in this year that on the global scale, people started learning that it wasn't just First Nations children who went to residential schools, that it also was Métis children who went. Where it gets confusing, where we kind of got lost, is in the legal process, in these administrative processes. So in Canada, there was a landmark case, sorry, the words are escaping me. But through litigation, there was the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. That was litigated. It was negotiated with, the complainants, and as well as the federal government and the Catholic Church. In that process, only a handful of residential schools got named on the list of what was a residential school, what students will get compensation for going to these schools. In those negotiations, it was only Catholic and federally funded residential schools. There were, though, provincially funded residential schools that served the same purpose. There was day schools, there was industrial schools, there were convents that were run by the churches in Canada that were sometimes federally funded, sometimes provincially funded, sometimes both. And these nuances, though, led to the exclusion of Métis people being recognized through this settlement agreement. The settlement agreement also was the trigger for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. So it didn't fully have the mandate to totally hear Métis stories during that process. But we're doing the work within the Métis Nation to now meet with the remaining Métis residential school survivors. It's estimated about 10% of Indigenous children who went to residential school were Métis. We don't know the exact number, if it may be more, but there are still schools that go unrecognized as residential schools. So one of the big pieces that we're doing is lobbying the federal government for the recognition that some of these institutions served the same purposes as residential schools, and that the children who went to those institutions deserve to be recognized. They deserve to be compensated. They went through the same horrors that First Nations children went to. And just this past March, April, we were able to bring a delegation of residential school survivors over to the Vatican. We went with the Assembly of First Nations, who's the national representative of First Nations people in Canada, as well as Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, who is the national representative of Inuit in Canada. We all took delegations over to Rome to meet with Pope Francis to tell him of the horrors of residential schools and the role of the Catholic Church within these institutions. And on April 1st of 2022, those residential school survivors who were there actually received an apology from the Pope. And then this past summer, we saw a papal visit to Canada. It was his promise to come to Canada, to come to our territories, to again re-deliver that apology to as many Indigenous residential school survivors as possible. He did that. It doesn't solve all of the problems of residential schools, but for some Métis residential school survivors, it really did support them in their healing journey to move forward, to have that recognition that these horrors happened, and that this religion played a huge role in it. And so that's answering that question very long form, but yeah.
But I think it's super important, and I think the concept that the knowledge about residential schools is foundational to Canadian history, and I actually think it's foundational to American history. So I'm going to take a brief moment here to talk about residential schools. For those of you who are listening and are American, you also had them here. They were, you may have heard of something, I don't love this name, so forgive me, Cassidy, but Indian boarding school or Indian day school. So there's the Carlisle Indian School is one in Pennsylvania that people who are listening right now may be familiar with that name. So when we talk about residential schools in Canada, we're really talking about, and Cassidy, jump in because you are the expert in this part, but I'll give a brief overview really quick. Is essentially you're talking about the abduction, the forced abduction of children with RCMP breaking into, police, agents of the government, with at times literally break into people's homes to take their children. And the children were then put into often boarding schools, those Cassie, as you said, it's not always boarding schools, away from their families, away from their culture, away from their language. And it was brutal. It was absolutely brutal. I mean, is that a fair overview, Cassie? Did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, essentially what these schools tried to do, it was for the purpose of assimilating Indigenous children into Western European culture. And, that was the goal. There was no roadmap for how that was to happen. And because of that, the people in these institutions were taught that our way of knowing and being, our languages, our culture was lesser than, and our children were treated like that, often facing physical, sexual, mental abuse. Many of them being murdered, children being murdered and buried in unmarked graves, and we've seen that in Canada. just in this last year as well, the discovery or uncovery of unmarked graves in Canada and in the United States as well. That's starting to happen. That work of the ground penetrating radar at these institutions to find thousands of anomalies of children who were buried and never returned home. It's a horrific history that our country is only just coming to terms with in Canada. But it's a conversation that we absolutely have to have in order to, first of all, make sure that it never happens again. But also, you can't know where you're going in the future without knowing where you come from. And if we're lying about our history, if we're lying about our past, then, how do we actually move forward and create a better Canada for all of us if we are lying about our histories?
Right. Thank you. No, that's great. And I think that's so crucial for us here too. Like, we need to know the history. We cannot move forward without looking at it. We talk a lot, and you mentioned the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I will say this for people who are watching. I've been putting links in the chat to things that Cassidy mentioned. So if you click on the various links that I put in there, you should see some familiar names, some things that she was talking about. But I do want to say, we use these terms, and we use them here too, truth and reconciliation. But as we know, you cannot have reconciliation without truth. And so that is just the foundational work, I think, is being a truth teller. So there are a couple more questions. So the next one is from one of our favorite, very, very faithful watchers with the things that we do here with Prince George's County Memorial Library System in our office. And Miss Vivian, so first of all, it's great to see you, Miss Vivian. And she is wondering about Thanksgiving. So of course, I know a little bit about this answer, but Cassidy, I'm going to let you take it. Are you going to celebrate? And so just to give you context, Cassidy, that is next week here in the United States.
Yeah, so we have a different Thanksgiving Day here in Canada. And there's been, in the last little while, a movement to, again, when people understand Canada's true history, wanting to move away from celebrating these colonial holidays, these colonial celebrations that have actually perpetuated tremendous harms to our people. I personally don't celebrate Thanksgiving. I love the meal. I won't lie to you. So my husband and I cook a meal on that day. But we call it harvest. It's our harvest season. That's when we're bringing in all of the goodies that we've grown throughout the year, and we're thankful for all of that we can sustain ourselves with. And so we celebrate the harvest. We celebrate the harvest moon. For us, that's in October, and that's how we do it. Like we say though, it's important to talk about why people might not celebrate Thanksgiving, not celebrate, again, these imposed imposed ways of knowing and being on us, and to be critical about that. It's important conversations to have, just as I think Canada actually followed the United States's the United States really started the movement of being critical about the statues that commemorate and memorialize individuals who, again, perpetuated huge harms and traumas to certain minorities, to certain peoples, infringed upon others' human rights. That really largely started in the United States, and Canada actually followed suit a few years later and starting to be a little bit more critical about the statues that exist in Canada. I think at one time there was dozens of statues across this country of our first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald. He was the one who was actually one of the engineers of residential schools. He was the one who hired individuals to create these institutions to assimilate and destroy our people. And so now people are being critical about celebrating these individuals, and how do we tell our history in a way that doesn't just put somebody up on a pedestal and really celebrate them without telling that full story. So I think, it's the same type of critical thinking and analysis of those holidays as it is with the statues of these individuals, just thinking critically about, what were their role, and where did this come from, and how did this actually impact the people that were of these lands prior to settlement.
Right. Thank you. That was a really full, great answer. We have another one. I'm wondering approximately how many Métis people are there?
That's a fantastic question. So we actually don't have a way of knowing. So for a number of different reasons, and one of them largely because we didn't have our own ways of registering our own Métis citizens for a number of years, and we're only starting to do that within the last, I'd say, 20 plus years, to do that in a way where we can analyze the genealogy, make sure that that person actually connects to the historic Métis Nation. But that is also the choice of a Métis individual to register with one of our Métis governments. It's not automatic. You don't just get Métis citizenship. You have to do the work because, you know, we're born in this country as Canadian citizens. You don't get to choose to be a Métis citizen first, which is also a fascinating concept to think about. But right now, with the 4 Métis governments that I represent, that I speak on behalf of, there's about 165,000 registered Métis citizens. But again, that's not fully inclusive. Our Canadian census, when we do have a national census, is also incorrect because it allows for self-identification. It doesn't actually vet somebody's genealogy to make sure that that's true. So in our 2016 census, we saw a huge skyrocket of the number of Métis people in Canada. It's false, it's wrong data. It's actually causing a lot of harm for us as well, because it's actually showing that our socioeconomic gaps are closing when they're not, because there are non-Métis people who are, you know, better off than our Métis communities who are claiming that. But there's also no way to count the individuals who may have moved out of the country. So my mom's sister, for example, she's a Métis woman. She lives in Switzerland. She hasn't been on the Canadian census in the last number of years, and she's not a registered Métis citizen with one of our governments. So that's a big question mark, other than the fact that I can very firmly say that the Métis National Council, through its Métis governments, has about 165,000 Métis citizens.
Wow, this is a complex thing. And the next question, I think you've covered, but it follows nicely to this one, which is, how does one gain recognition as Métis, and who determines the criteria?
So we determine the criteria. And that is because we have our own right to do so. That is actually, I think it's Article 33 of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, that say that we get to determine our own ways of identifying our citizens and our own institutions to represent and to govern our people. But again, it is just this broad knowledge of where the Métis people come from. Our historians who talk about these communities and this process of ethnogenesis, where you can tie your lineage back to. That's how it is. So to become a Métis registered citizen with one of our governments, we have registries. We have verified registries where you fill out the paperwork, you bring your genealogy, your family tree, and then we have genealogists who look at it, can tie you to the historic Métis Nation or not, and if you can, then you are issued a citizenship card.
All right. Thank you very much. Okay, so I just saw the time and I'm a little panicked because I have many things I want to talk to you about. So there's a couple of things. So I'm going to give you a choice between 2 themes. So one is to talk more fully about Métis culture, which we haven't touched on. The other one is what I said before, which is really talking about you as what does it mean as a young person, as a woman, to be socially engaged, civic. That's a whole thing. So do you have a theme that you'd like to address?
Let's do the latter.
Okay, this is awesome. So for everybody listening, as you can see, Cassie is a young woman, first woman president of the Métis National Council, and also youngest by a fair margin, right?
Yes.
Is that fair?
It is fair to say the youngest to be the president of the Métis National Council. I always add the caveat that I'm not the youngest Métis president, though, because even Louis Riel, like I talked about, one of our Métis heroes, when he started the first Métis provisional government back in the 1880s, he was only 25. And so, you know, young leadership within the Métis Nation is actually, I am not an anomaly. But through the Métis National Council, I am. And that is because, you know, our people had to kind of conform to certain standards and norms, social norms, to fight for the recognition that we do have today. But when I was elected, I took over for an individual who was in this role for almost 20 years, a man in his close to, if not already, retirement years. And and that really shocked people. It shocked people, but I think it also gave a big kind of refresh to the work that we're doing. I do a lot of work with our elders who talk about how, you know, the Métis Nation is a matriarchal society. It always has been. It has been our women leaders who have moved us forward. And so I have a great amount of support from our Métis citizens who like to see this big change, but it is a huge change. And, you know, part of what I want to do in this role, I mean, there's so much that I want to do in this role, but a big part of what I want to do is really show, you know, the Métis Nation, show our citizens, but also Canadians and the world that leadership doesn't have to look or act or talk a certain way. You can bring your own unique self. You can lead with values and principles, and you don't have to go into rooms and demand certain things, and you don't have to act certain ways. You know, for me, I like to lead with kindness and with love, and that is very different than the ways that has been done before. But that's the way that I have been taught by my family and my elders and my communities, and it is very different. But for me, I want to show people that leadership doesn't have to look a certain way or act a certain way, so that we are creating space for you know, the next generation of leaders to come in and be themselves and bring their own selves to these roles, and you know, really change the future in the ways that they want to change the future.
That's powerful. And I love that message. I actually put it in the chat that leadership doesn't have to look or act or talk a certain way, because that is so important. And I think that people, those of us who don't look or identify in the ways that we see people in power all the time, we can feel like there was not space for, and in fact, I think it's also been true often that there has not been space for us. And so to have somebody active and involved and showing, you know, as you said, the world, people get to see you as a global leader, which is just fantastic. So, I mean, kudos to you. And I want to talk about a couple of things. So I'd love to hear about your personal journey. Like, how did you get where you are now?
Yeah. So for so many young Indigenous people, we grow up knowing who we are, knowing what our families have been through, knowing that we want to create change for our future generations. There is still so much trauma that exists within our communities. There's so much injustice that our families and communities and nations face today, systems that perpetuate injustices on our people. And when we grow up, and for me, you know, coming from a place of privilege where I was able to go to university, I was the first in my entire family to graduate with a university degree, wanting to create change for the nation. Growing up thinking the best way to do that, and we see this today for so many young Indigenous people, the best way to do that is to go to law school, and to fight from within, understand the systems. And so that was the trajectory that I was on. I went and I did my undergraduate degree. But from there, I didn't go to law school right away. I took a step back, and different opportunities started coming my way. I did an internship program with the provincial government in British Columbia, which then led me to working with an Indigenous consulting firm that did program evaluation and research, looking at social justice programs in Indigenous communities all across Canada. things that I didn't know existed when I was that young woman who was on the path to go to law school. And, you know, I still, while I said yes to all of these opportunities, in my head, I thought, okay, I'm still going to go to law school. I'll just take this year and do this work. And what I found myself doing was asking myself two questions. And I'd always ask myself, is this opportunity creating or contributing to the goal that I have where I want to create positive change for my nation? And if it's yes, then that's great. The other question that I would always ask myself is this making me happy? And wow. So if it was yes to both of those questions, then I would take that opportunity and I would run with it. So that actually ended up, I went into Métis politics when I was young. It was 2016 when I entered Métis politics for the first time at the provincial level in British Columbia. I was the minister responsible for youth. I did a whole bunch of work with Métis youth in British Columbia, but also across Canada, exposed to many different opportunities, building relationships along the way with Métis people, with individuals within the federal government, with First Nations and Inuit people as well. And those relationships led to more opportunities where, again, it was making me happy and it was contributing to my goal of creating positive change for my nation. Then I came into the time when I said, okay, finally it's time to go to law school. I did the LSAT, I wrote the test, I passed, I got into law school. But at the same time, I was just loving the work that I was doing. I started my own consulting firm and I was doing work with municipalities in Canada, helping them build relationships with Indigenous communities that they were around, really building bridges, trying to brighten the future for all Canadians. And so another opportunity that came my way was to do my master's in community development. So I had to make the decision, do I go to law school or do I continue doing what I'm absolutely loving right now and further my education in something that is going to contribute to the work that I'm doing? So that's what I did. I started my master's in community development, did all my coursework, was loving it. And then this opportunity dropped in my lap. Yeah. And so that's where I was. I haven't finished my master's yet. It was September 2021 when there was going to be an election for the Métis National Council. We talked with my friends, my family, and my community, elders, and talked about, what's needed for the future of the Métis Nation right now, who can take us there. And, my name got brought up a number of times, and it was something that I never thought I was going to do. I didn't think in a million years it was going to happen. And it did. And so again, it's creating change in a different way than I thought I ever would for my nation. It makes me happy. It's absolutely frustrating and so challenging, but it makes me happy. And to know that I'm trying to do this work for our future generations, to create this positive change. And that's what's brought me here today. It's been asking those two questions throughout my life. And also, I really attribute it to the relationships that I was able to build throughout my life.
Mm-hmm. I think those two questions are awesome. Like when you said, is this the first one, which, is this heading my people in a good direction? I mean, that was not your exact words, but I was just thinking, like, what if I had made choices in my own life with so much focus? That's a journey for another time. But in seriousness, like, what if that was how we drove ourselves? Like, that is incredible, Cassidy, because I mean, not only are you here doing incredible things, but for those of us, if we all had that focus, or we could bring that focus, the change that we would make, and it might be small. I mean, we're not all going to be, global leaders, but in our small worlds, the ways that we can have such impact with having those two questions on the forefront of our minds, like, that's just awesome. It's really, really good. So I told you when we were talking before that one of the things we do with the library system is we have a series, which is Voting, Democracy, and Action. And we're really talking about, why does civic engagement matter? why does it matter to be involved, and how can you get involved, and how do you keep the energy going? And so for you as a young person, I thought you'd be a perfect person to kind of talk about that, like just getting involved. What is it, and what might civic engagement look like for people?
Yeah. So first and foremost, on a very basic level, it's so important. And it's important for so many different reasons, but first and foremost is because your voice matters. Even if you don't think it does, it absolutely matters. And what you have to say and what you represent and who you represent, even if it's just you're representing yourself, you're bringing your ancestors along with you when you speak, and that matters to bring that forward into decision-making processes today, even just into conversations within your own community, to make sure that your perspectives are heard, that you are contributing to your community in the way that you feel is positive and is going to create positive change for you, for your family, for your future generations. It's just so important in so many different ways. But civic engagement doesn't have to, again, it doesn't have to look or be a certain way. What I always say to Métis citizens is that there's a role for everybody to play in building a brighter future for everybody. Find what you're passionate about and pursue that, and be that voice in that space where you feel comfortable. Not everybody has to be, you don't have to hold elected office to create change. There are so many different avenues for you to have your voice heard, to be engaged in your community. And I just think that, just know that you matter, know that your voice matters, and find what you're passionate about and voice that.
It's only 2.5 years, but I managed to stay muted there for a second. No, and it's great. I mean, this is such an important message. And I think it's, again, why it's so wonderful to have somebody that is a woman, a young person, an Indigenous person out there as a global leader, and showing people what is possible. And I love the message that you don't have to, it's not about that you have to try to recreate that, but that you matter and what you have to contribute matters. That's super important. We really have time for probably one more question, which is, I'll just give you one that I'm just curious about on a personal level, which is, tell us about some of your travels. I know you went to Rome, you just went to Egypt. What else? What's another highlight for you?
Well, this is going to sound cheesy and cliche, but honestly, it's traveling around the Métis Nation homeland is my favorite part. I think that it's an opportunity that a lot of Canadians don't actually get, is to travel around your own country. For those of you who've had the opportunity to travel to Canada, you probably know it is extremely expensive to travel within this country. For me to fly from one end of the country to the other is probably the same amount of money that my husband and I could fly to Europe for. So it's an opportunity that I never take for granted, to travel around this country. For example, just this summer, when the Pope was in Canada, we traveled from Edmonton to Quebec up to Iqaluit to the north. And I've never been up there. That's a really cool opportunity. But just in this last year, there's been some really incredibly large global events that have happened, and I've been very privileged to attend. And so first and foremost, over to Rome and the Vatican to meet with Pope Francis, to share our stories as Métis people and how residential schools has impacted our people. Just a few months ago, I was actually part of Canada's delegation to attend Queen Elizabeth's funeral. So there was 10 individuals who attended on behalf of Canada. I was the youngest to attend that delegation. Again, these historic moments that I never thought I would be a part of, but then thinking about what that means for our people, to be a part of that as an Indigenous woman, that never would have happened in our history before now. And what does that signal for the future? For me, I think it signals inclusion of Indigenous people into these global historic things that are happening. And then just most recently, last week, I was over in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, to participate in COP27 to make sure that Métis perspectives are heard in the negotiations for tackling the climate crisis, making sure that the world knows how the climate crisis is affecting Métis people and Indigenous people are globally disproportionately. To make sure that people know that this really matters to us as Indigenous people. And then, yeah, just coming back to Canada just last week to attend our Remembrance Day ceremonies. It's been a privilege to be able to do so much travel and to have our perspectives heard and to be this spokesperson on the national and international level. But it's a responsibility that I absolutely do not take lightly.
Well, this has been so awesome, Cassidy. Like, it's been, a pleasure to be able to sort of watch from afar over the years and see what you're doing. And I remember when you started your consulting firm and being like, oh, what are you doing? Because you just contribute so fully, and it's been great. And the fact that you would, this is a symbol of your contribution, the fact that you would choose to spend some time with a county and a country that you're not from, and that, like, what a gift that is to all of us. And so I really, really, really want to thank you for your time to us in Prince George's County, and what you're doing in Canada is huge. For everybody watching, thank you so much for being with us. We have put a bunch of links in the chat. I really hope you're able to go through them and check them out and learn a little bit about the Métis Nation, and also about the history of your sister country there, Canada, which has a lot of overlap with the United States. And it's really worth considering. Things that you see happen in Canada, I'll be frank, have also happened or are happening here. And it's pretty good to just be aware of it and think about it, and look at, as Cassidy says, how we can make decisions about how we're going to go forward if we know what's happened in the past. So everyone, it's been absolutely wonderful. There's some wonderful comments. People are thanking. I'll put a couple up, but we're getting some nice thanks in the chats and everything. But I'm going to, for now, say goodnight. And again, thank you so much, Cassidy.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Goodbye.